Good evening. My name is Rachel Young Fields. I'm the president of the Savannah Book Festival Board of Directors. On behalf of my fellow board members and the festival staff, welcome to the 16th Annual Savannah Book Festival. I know, right? The festival is presented by our good friends and dedicated supporters, the Philip E. and Nancy B. Beekman Foundation, David and Nancy Centron, Robert Faircloth, the Courtney Knight Gaines Foundation, the Gerald D. and Helen M. Stevens Foundation, and through a generous grant from Georgia Humanities. So thank you to our sponsors. Well, tonight we are very fortunate to hear from internationally celebrated author George Dawes Green to kick off what will surely be another magnificent festival weekend. As you likely know, we were originally scheduled to hear from Jack Carr tonight. However, circumstances arose that prevented Jack from being able to join us, and we are incredibly grateful to George for making himself available to us tonight, and we're grateful to you for adapting to this modification. We know it's going to be a great evening. Before this evening's address, we hosted a reception to honor our literati. Those members of the foundation of the Savannah Book Festival. For the past 16 years, literati members from across our community and across the country have faithfully supported our mission of celebrating the written word in Savannah, and we are so grateful. Would all the literati members present please stand up? And please join me in thanking these individuals for being such a significant support system. I also want to recognize Mrs. Mara Sovchin as the generous sponsor of our headlining author. So thank you to Mara for making tonight possible. Each year, the festival relies on a network of approximately 200 volunteers, without whom there would be no festival. Some of these special volunteers are serving as your ushers tonight. So please join me in giving a round of applause for the members of the Book Club Sisters, the Page Turners, and the Word Warriors Book Clubs. If you are interested in volunteering to help with the Savannah Book Festival, we would love to have you. Please visit our website for details on how you can get involved. And a very special thank you to the 31 authors who arrived a day early to participate in SBF at schools. Yeah. Through this program, festival authors will visit public and private middle and high schools and universities in our community, giving Savannah students a chance to interact with nationally recognized and prize-winning authors who are sharing their early educational experiences, influences, and successes in their writing lives. Thanks to an investment provided by the City of Savannah through the Cultural Affairs Commission, SBF is able to provide copies of our authors' books to public school students participating in SBF at schools. So thank you to the City of Savannah for that opportunity. Well, we hope you'll be with us throughout the festival, including on Saturday, when more than 40 authors will be presenting in venues around Telfair, Wright, and Chippewa Squares. Over the last 16 years, SBF has provided the gift of Festival Saturday to the book lovers of Savannah and our friends from all over the country for free. It's because of your generosity and support that we are able to do this. Nearly 90% of the festival's income is from sponsorships and donations. This year, the cost to put on the festival, that's transportation and accommodation for the authors, venues and tent rental, have increased significantly, while our income has largely stayed the same. On the back of your program, you'll find a QR code enabling you to donate to the festival through Venmo. If you're not already a supporter of the Savannah Book Festival, please help us keep Festival Saturday free by donating today. If you haven't done so already, we encourage you to download the wonderful Savannah Book Festival app, which will provide you the most up-to-date information for the festival that includes the authors, times, and venues, and you can look in your program for information on downloading that app. Also in the back of your program, you will find a QR code for a survey. This is a joint survey with the City of Savannah, and it's important to the funding of the arts in our community. So if you take a minute to fill it out, we'd really appreciate it. Okay, a few final notes, and then I'm gonna leave. We ask you to not use any flash photography, and please remember to turn off your cell phone or silence it. George Dawes Green will be answering questions following the presentation tonight, and then he'll be signing festival-purchased copies of his books. More details on that at the end. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce you to Ariel Felton, a local journalist and a member of the Savannah Book Festival Board of Directors, who will be in conversation with George tonight. So, without further ado, please welcome Ariel Felton.
Good evening, everyone. How are you doing? Good. I hope you're all very excited for Book Festival weekend. I know that I am. This year's opening speaker, George Dawes Green, is an internationally celebrated author. George published his first novel, The Caveman's Valentine, in 1994. Not only did he win the Edgar Award for the best first novel by an American author, but in 2001, the novel was adopted into a film starring Samuel L. Jackson. What a debut, right? Yeah, you can clap for that, absolutely. George's second book, The Juror, was published in 1995 and was a bestseller in over 20 languages. The Juror was also adapted into a 1996 film that starred Alec Baldwin and Demi Moore. After taking the publishing world by storm, George decided to share his love of storytelling in a new way. In 1997, he founded The Moth, a nonprofit storytelling organization based in New York City. His inspiration for The Moth was born from late nights with friends spent exchanging stories while moths flitted into the light. The Moth brings the power of personal storytelling to millions of people each year through live and virtual shows, storytelling workshops, a Peabody Award-winning podcast, The Moth Radio Hour, and New York Times best-selling books. The goal? To create community and build empathy around the world. The Moth has impactfully told over 50,000 stories since 1997 and has been hailed by Time Out New York as the most trusted name in storytelling. But George was far from finished. His next book, The Ravens, released in 2008, was also critically acclaimed and hailed by the LA Times as a triumphant return. His most recent work is set in a city that we all know and love, right here in Savannah, Georgia. The mystery suspense novel titled The Kingdoms of Savannah was published on July 19th of last year and is the book he will speak to us about today. The New York Times called Kingdoms of Savannah layered, but like a parfait, goes down sweet, chilled, and easy. Saturated in regional detail and studded with oddballs, it has the flavor of a Southern Gothic without that bitter aftertaste. In an August 2022 interview with WAB in Atlanta, George said, "I am in love with Savannah, and I always have been since I was a little boy. I know that I'm not alone when I say I think that the city of Savannah is very lucky to have George back with us this weekend." So, on behalf of the Savannah Book Festival's Board of Directors, I want to thank George for stepping up to the plate at the last minute and for his willingness to be this year's opener. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming our opening speaker, George Dawes Green. Of course. Good evening, George. Did you miss us?
Well, yeah, I always miss Savannah in the heart of the New York winter.
Right, you're visiting at a good time. You reminded me, I was going to say, I have to apologize, everyone. If you are from Savannah, you know that the pollen came out a little early, so if I'm sniffly on the microphone, if I sneeze, I apologize. Please bear with me. Okay, so George, So many people have written about not just Savannah, but the Low Country in general, and you spent a lot of time here growing up. Can you talk about how you experienced the city as a child, and what do you think it is about Savannah that captures writers' imaginations?
Wow. I don't come from Savannah, but when I was a boy of 11, my parents and I moved down to Brunswick, Georgia, and then my mother was raised in Waynesboro and Savannah, and she loved Savannah and called it our capital city, and was constantly reminding me that I was an 8th generation Savannian. And so every Sunday, we would get into her gigantic Chevrolet Bel Air, and she had some beautiful hat that she'd wear.
Of course, it was Sunday.
And then we would drive up from Brunswick on Route 17, because in those days there was no I-95. And so it was just like proceeding in a barge, because it was this beautiful, huge automobile. And then we drive into this spectacularly beautiful and dying city. And we would go to visit my cousins and spend the afternoon in very hot parlors. My mother's name was Inez. She was named for her grandmother. Her grandmother was sort of the matriarch of our family, and she had passed. Big Inez had died, but my mother was one of many cousins named Inez. So we would sit there on Sunday afternoons with the Inezes, and who were the sweetest little old ladies. And my mother would then have seances. I don't know are any of you familiar with the tip table? Come on, there's got to be some. Tip tables were the old form of the way that we would connect with ghosts. They didn't go in for the Ouija board because that was considered very high tech. The tip table, you just sit around and everybody would put their pinkies together, and then on a little sort of three-legged table. And then my mother would say, after the proper amount of silence, she would finally say, "Is there a spirit present in the room?" And then the table would tip and come back with a little rap, which meant yes. And then she would say, "And does the spirit have a message for us?" And the spirit invariably did have a message. And the spirit invariably turned out to be Big Inez. And we would sit there, and my mother would go through the alphabet. A, B, C, D. And then she'd go through the alphabet until finally the table would tip and come back with a rap.
Wow.
And it might be far down the alphabet. And I might be getting really hot and exhausted and bored. But it didn't matter. The message that I remember, we had to go to the letter W.
Wow.
And then she would start it all over again. A, B. I had to do this, so you're going to have to do this too. You're just going to have to be patient. And the Inezes didn't go in for air conditioning. That was that generation that felt like this was too expensive, and so we would sit there in the great heat, and there was They all wore either a lavender perfume or an iris perfume.
Wow, so you were sleepy, is what you're saying.
So I was sleepy, and there was all this perfume. And honestly, every now and then, one, and I never knew which one, would pass gas. And there was one time when my cousin, it was actually my great aunt, Inez Wright. It was just obvious that somebody had passed gas. And Inez Wright said, "Big Inez." Anyway, we finally get to through the alphabet again and again and again. And I remember this particular message. This message from Big Inez was, "Wrong direction."
Wow.
It took like 25 minutes
I was
to
just
come
about
out.
to ask how long.
Wrong direction. Now, I had no idea what wrong direction meant, but the Inezes all knew that it meant that our country was going in the wrong direction, because this is what, Big Inez had come from another world, and everybody felt that the world, Big Inez actually was there when Sherman's army came through. In Waynesboro, Georgia, she was at the plantation, and which is a whole other story. But Big Inez had remembered and told my mother all about those days, which Big Inez thought were the good old days. And there was a general sense with this group that there were good old days and there was great love in those days. To me, it was an incredibly oppressive experience. I loved my cousins. I loved Savannah, but I found all of that to be too much. So when I was 15 years old, I finally left high school, put out my thumb, and hitchhiked to New York City. And I thought that I had left this world behind forever. But Savannah has a way of bringing you back.
It's true. That is very true.
And I've never gotten rid of Savannah. And as I say, I love Savannah deeply. It is the most beautiful city, certainly in the country. Oglethorpe did an amazing job. Yes, applause for General Oglethorpe. But it's also a city of great darkness. So it was actually fascinating for me to sit down and finally write about it.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. That was a lovely story. I wish I could know the Inezes. So we talked a little bit earlier before coming out here about how many great writers come from Savannah, or writers that write about Savannah. It's a very popular place to put down on the page. So do you have a particular favorite piece of writing about Savannah, or a favorite writer from here, maybe someone who inspired you while you were working on your book?
I do. I mean, there are many people, many writers from Savannah that moved me. Of course, Flannery O'Connor.
That's a big one, yes.
Although Flannery didn't write much about Savannah. She wrote The Temple of the Holy Ghost, which is that amazing story, which is probably about Savannah, although even that's in dispute. But we feel as though Flannery was, that the spirit of Savannah entered her bones when she was a little girl, even though she left when she was 12. She, it's a strange legacy. Every writer from Savannah owes a great deal to Flannery O'Connor, although it's a very, very complicated relationship that I have with Flannery. Years ago, I gave a talk here at this festival, and we had a number of people just up on stage talking about Flannery. An amazing writer. I'm also incredibly moved by Aubergine, who, how many of you all know Aubergine? Applaud if you know Aubergine. Okay, well, just a thought that Bergeny is our great Savannah poet, rather a recluse. He lives out, well, I won't say where, but he came a few months ago when we did the book, when I had a reading to introduce the book, and Bergeny came out for the first time in years to tell a story of how his brother was shot by the Savannah police when he was about 6 years old and his brother was 14. It was an amazing story that had everybody weeping. A man who, just a riveting, brilliant poet. He also is someone who's, he wrote this book called The Dreams of the Immortal City, which is, again, he has a complicated relationship with Savannah. But anyway, I recommend Bergeny to everyone.
Yeah, that was my first night meeting him, and hearing that story was very impactful. I remember that. It was a lovely story.
Yeah.
So living here, it was really fun to read Kingdoms of Savannah and recognize some of the businesses that characters frequent, or even the roads that they're driving on. To me, Bo Peep's, which is a bar in the book, reminded me of Pinky Masters. Are there any other hidden gems that were inspiration from Savannah that maybe folks didn't pick up on, and you're waiting for them to realize this store is obviously this place?
Oh yeah, mostly I gave the stores their real names. Most of the places. Bo Peep's, I just wanted to use Bo Peep. Bo Peep had been in competition with Pinky Masters years and years ago. Bo Peep.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, he was a bootlegger. And so he had his own bar, Bo Peep's. And there are a lot of people who believe, and whether this is true or not, I don't know for sure, but a lot of people believe that bootleggers use the storm drains underneath the city to run their liquor in. And that's the story that came down through Bo Peep's family. And then I use the storm drains. If you ask about anything that I find amazing about Savannah, I once had the opportunity to go down into the storm drains.
Oh, wow.
And they are incredible. It's like going down to the sewers of Paris. It's, and so I wrote about the storm drains in Kingdoms of Savannah. There are some really crucial scenes down there. But you'll go along this sort of passageway, which is brick, and then come to an enormous vaulted room, which is 3 stories high, vaulted with bricks, sort of like a little cathedral underneath our city. They've sprayed that, polyethylene or whatever, I don't know what it's called. They sprayed it on a lot of the storm drains. But there are still a few of those old drains left. I don't know why they don't open it for tourists. It would be fabulous.
So you did all of this just for research for the book. That is amazing dedication. I'm not sure I would have the guts to go down there myself.
I wasn't actually researching the book at the time. I just got an offer. Jay, who worked for the Film Commission, said that he knew somebody at Stormwater. I said, I want to go down there. And so he said, yeah, I'll go to the Department of Stormwater. And they allowed me to go down, which was amazing.
Wow, no,
and then
amazing.
I have friends for years who were living in the encampments who had a way to sneak into the storm drains. So that was amazing.
Okay. So you said earlier you split your time between this area and New York, but I'm wondering, do you ever find time to write here in Savannah? And if so, do you have any favorite locations to set up with a laptop and just write for a few hours?
Yes. Foxy Loxy.
It's a great place.
How many know Foxy Loxy? Yeah. There we go. Good. I love Foxy Loxy. I was thinking, I love many cafes in town. And I talk more about the Sentient Bean in the book just because it's more centrally located and the characters are always going into Sentient Bean. But I love Foxy Loxy. It's really one of those extraordinary places. Recently, I was in Australia I was there about 2 days ago, and hanging out at this cafe, which, like Foxy Loxy, has a lot of little rooms and then this beautiful garden in back, and just becomes sort of a central place. One of the reasons I really love Savannah is this real sense of community. You can go to Foxy Loxy. I took my a number of friends who came down to visit back to that garden, and just folks would come up all day long that we knew. I love that Savannah still has that sense of community. It's the brilliant thing about Savannah is, I mean, when I wrote The Kingdoms of Savannah, I'm writing about all of these different neighborhoods in Savannah. I think I was inspired by the Alexandria Quartet, which is about Alexandria, and there are all these different neighborhoods that Durrell wrote about, that the characters were passing, back and forth. But Alexandria is a really big city. Savannah is very small, but it has all these very, very distinct neighborhoods. And, there's black neighborhoods. There are the sort of wealthy neighborhoods. There's the tourist area, which is just filled with ghost tours, which are their own bizarre world. There'll be a gay neighborhood, there will be, a homeless neighborhood, and my characters sort of slip in and amongst all of them.
Yeah, no, that's very true. I feel like in your book, you play with the idea of kingdoms. I feel like each of your characters has their own sort of kingdom in their neighborhood, whether it's, Morgana or Ransom or Jazz or even Stony. They each have their own kingdom in their community, and it's very nice.
Yeah, thank you.
Of course. All right, let's dive into the book some more. All right, so although the book is fiction, I know that it deals with some very real history about a group of black soldiers here in Savannah. So can you tell us about that history that inspired this book?
Yes. So one of the things that happens in this book involves a community. So the book is a contemporary thriller, but it goes back into the history. The solution to the mystery really involves understanding Savannah's history. And one thing in particular was there was a community during the Revolutionary War. There were hundreds of black soldiers who fought on England's side. And they fought in the Battle of Savannah, and they won the Battle of Savannah. I mean, they were instrumental in that victory. And then after the war, they refused to go back into slavery. And so a number of them went to what was probably an already existing community of Maroons, that is, fugitives from slavery, living on a wilderness island about 15 miles north of Savannah. Today it's part of the Savannah Wildlife Refuge. And they went and they built a fortress about half a mile long. It was, by fortress I mean they built a wall, and then they had inside, they had houses. They built more than 20 houses, and they had fields, they had gardens, they had at least 14 boats that we know about, and and it was this sort of amazing fortress of black resistance right in the middle of the slaveholding South that lasted for many years. The Georgia militia came to attack them, and they whooped the Georgia militia. And then finally, the Georgia and South Carolina formed an alliance, and their militia was able to get in, find the fortress, which had been hidden, and they were able to defeat these Maroons, as we call them. But it looks like many of the Maroons were able to escape, and they made their way down through the jungle, down to Spanish Florida, petitioned the king for asylum, which was granted. And then they disappeared from history for about 230 years. A few academics wrote about this only fortified Maroon community in the United States. There is actually a lot of documentary evidence, but it wasn't until maybe the last 10 or 15 years that people really began to write about this. The Kingdoms of Savannah is, I guess, the first sort of popular book that talks about this community. And so since I wrote the book, there's been a lot of interest from historians. Recently, some foundations have gotten interested, and it looks like there will be, we hope, some archaeological research and some historical research. Yeah. It just seems to me, it's such an amazing story and such an amazing incident in Savannah's history that it's astonishing that it's been lost.
Right. I was just going to say, it's not something that I was familiar with until I read your book, and I've heard that from a lot of folks too. I'm wondering, once you knew that you wanted this history in your book, where did you go for more information about this community of people?
Sorry.
No, you're fine. You're good.
Well, I first heard about it from John Duncan. Do you all know John Duncan? John, who passed from us a few months ago, an extraordinary historian, an extraordinary Savannian. He told me about it about 25 years ago. He just happened to mention that there had been this community of black former soldiers for the King of England. And then I decided to research. So I went to the Georgia Historical Society, and I found as much as I could. I went up to look for the island. Couldn't find it. It's going to be that's going to be a very, very difficult process, but we think that it's still up there.
Yeah. So you went by canoe. I feel like I've heard part of this story to find it. Yeah.
I went with my brother, who's an archaeologist, and Chad Ferries. Is Chad here? No. Yay! And Chad lent us his canoe and kayak, and then we all paddled up there and braved the mosquitoes and the no-see-ums, and it was a long, long day. We didn't make any big discoveries that day.
So as a journalist, I know that sometimes these historical accounts aren't well known because the documentation wasn't kept up or the stories didn't feel at the time like something worth saving. I'm just wondering, in all of your research, if you ran into any obstacles trying to find information about this community. Is there anything that you really wanted to know but couldn't find?
Well, we haven't. I mean, I guess, it's interesting. A great historian, Sylvain Diouf, wrote a book just a few years ago, Slavery's Exiles, which is about the Maroon communities of the United States. There were Maroon communities all over the United States, and this is something. By the way, is Paul Presley here? Because he also is a great writer about Maroon communities. Paul? No? Okay. Anyway, but a lot of you probably know Paul. He also writes about the Maroon communities. But honestly, when Sylviane wrote about them, she wrote about them because she said she was interested in finding out about them, and there was really nothing written about them. So this is a brand new subject that I think people are finally beginning to explore. There's a lot of documentary evidence. There's a lot now. Archaeology has a lot of new technological tools, beginning with LiDAR, so that probably a place like this that had this distinct wall around it, that had these rice fields, probably this place can be located.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like the start of something really great then,
Yeah.
and I hope that it does bring more attention to it then.
Yeah, I hope so.
So let's talk about the characters and kingdoms of Savannah. I've heard you say before that Morgana Musgrove was one of your favorite characters of the book. For those who haven't read it yet, she is a widow. She's part of high society of Savannah, and she's inherited her husband's detective agency and has decided to take on this murder mystery case. In the book, I think she's described as stunning, mean, smart, and nosy. So what inspired this character, and why is she one of your favorites?
Well, Morgana, first of all, she reminds me of my mother. Her son Ransom probably reminds me of me. A rather troubled young man, but Morgana, imperious, sometimes cruel, very witty, very southern. That's my mom. A little bit Big Inez went into it.
Yeah.
And a little bit, and I've told this story recently for The Moth, and I won't tell you the whole story, but you can go on The Moth, and I think they just put it out on the podcast. But it is the story. When I was 19, I had left home, and then I came back to Brunswick. I went to work for a hotline. Back in those days, there were these crisis hotlines. But it had to do with the war on drugs, which was a terrible failure. Crisis hotlines. I mean, I went to work thinking, I'm going to be helping people who are having terrible trips on LSD. That was the idea. There weren't any terrible trips on LSD. So I would sit there all night long in this crisis hotline with no calls coming in. Finally, this girl started calling. She was 17 years old. I call her Tara, and which isn't her real name, but it sort of sounds like her real name. And Tara would just call just because she was bored to death.
She just wanted someone to talk to.
And she'd just call and talk for hours and hours. And then finally, one night, Tara came to this house, this big old Victorian house where the crisis hotline was. And, the door opened, and there was this girl with these long ringlets, and she said, "Yeah, my therapist," because she was always sort of teasing me about being her therapist. And I said, "Tara, you actually can't come here. This isn't an inpatient thing." And she just turned and swept away, and she was gone, and she wouldn't call back. I did finally start to get these calls from really troubled people. One guy named Albert, who was in his 60s. He was a country gentleman, but he revealed to me after many hours that he had always been attracted to men when he was young. And even now, he said sometimes he'd put on a jacket and tie and he'd drive up to Savannah and go cruising. But he said, "I didn't do anything. I'm married. I just like to go for the drive." And there was another woman, Betty, who would call, and she was in her 50s, and she was a church woman, and she was always weeping. She was always crying. She'd just cry for hours. One time I asked her what she loved, and she said, "Well, I'm doing her voice. I can't do her voice." But she said, "Well, I love my Valium. And I love my Librium. And I love my little dog, Willie. because he fights for me. And I said, and I knew about Willie because Willie was her incontinent old poodle. And I said, how does Willie fight for you? And she said, well, today I was at the rectory and that horrible Mary Jo was talking about something just prattling on. And Willie came in and he made a doo-doo in Mary Jo's purse. And that dog just brightens my day. And then one night, Albert called, and he seemed particularly troubled and unhappy about his life. And I asked him, I said, Albert, is it hard to be a gay man in rural Georgia? And he said, I'm not gay. I'm married. I told you. I told you I'm married. And then he hung up. And I was devastated that I'd used the word so casually. But then he called back and said, George, can you come out here? He lived in Surrey, which is about an hour and a half from Brunswick. But I called my boss, who said, well, you should go out there if he's really, really upset. And if you think he's suicidal, you can't call the police. So we went out there. I drove out there to Albert's house in the middle of nowhere, went to the door, knocked on the door, and the door opened, and there was this girl with long red ringlets. And she said, my therapist. I can't believe you came. And I said, Tara, are you Albert? And she turned and said, Grandmother, I'm going to go out here and talk to my therapist for a while. And we went out, and she said, I'm Albert. And then this big shaggy dog came up, and she said, don't let him jump up. He'll make a doo-doo. And I said, Tara, are you Betty too? And she said, And I said, Tara, why are you inventing these people? And she said, I live in Surrey. I'm bored to death. You want a Jack and Coke? So I didn't have a drink with her. I left. The next day, my bosses at the crisis hotline, they were over the moon. They said, this is clearly a case of multiple personality. Which was, in those days, it was the holy grail for psychologists. So they couldn't wait for Tara to call back. She never did call back. I would go through Surrey. I finally just left that job. I finally went to the University of Georgia, which meant that I was driving back and forth. And then every now and then, I would I'd pass her house and I'd wonder, what happened to Tara? And I've been wondering that for about 50 years. And I finally decided, I bet that she came to Savannah and invented a character for herself. And that became Morgana Muskrat.
That was a lovely story. Thank you. Well, I could talk about kingdoms all night, but I think it is time to take some audience questions. So if you have a question, please stand up so we can see. I think there might be folks with microphones. Our volunteers are going to come around so we can hear everyone. Please, one question per person. And if it's a question about the book, try not to spoil the ending, because it's a murder mystery.
Right. Spoilers.
Any hands out there?
Okay, well, we're done.
That's it. If not, I have more questions. I just wanted to be fair.
I'm sure
I have a
somebody
question
has
down here.
I think I can hear you, yeah.
Thank you for writing the book. I'm a good friend of Dr. Presley's. He was my master, so...
Wait, would you say that again?
Is it on? Hello.
go.
Hi. I'm a former student of Dr. Presley's. He
As
came
are so many folks in Savannah.
Yay, Dr. Presley. He came and spoke to our book club about your book, and I think he tried to call you unsuccessfully. But thank you for being here. My daughter is in high school, and she is doing the Moth high school program, so thank you very much for that. My question is about the closure of the tent camp. Is that what it's called?
Yes.
And your thoughts on that.
Well, as I understand it, so in the Kingdoms of Savannah, there is, which is a fictional story, but there is an encampment underneath a fictional highway called the Harry S. Truman Parkway.
Never heard of it.
Under the exit ramp of the Harry S. Truman Parkway, there's an encampment of homeless people. I did, in real life, I used to spend a good bit of time out there because I had friends who lived out there and who were fabulous storytellers. And so I would go and spend lots of time. Every now and then the police would come in. Something would happen. There was a crime, or once there was a murder. There would be fires, and then the police would come in and bulldoze the place and close it down for good. And then 3 or 4 months later, the encampment would be back again. It's called, by the way, the Truman Marriott. And a few months ago, the Truman Marriott was closed by order of the police because of a fire. And so that was bulldozed. And I don't know, is it back yet? It will be soon. I mean, the problem is that obviously it's easy to close the places, but there's really nowhere for them to go.
Right, right.
So that's why, all of Savannah is encircled by encampments of the homeless. Yeah.
Thank you for that question. Anybody else? I see a hand up front in the middle down here. Okay, we have microphones coming.
My book club met yesterday and discussed the Kingdoms of Savannah.
Oh.
That was our book for this month. And they all asked me to ask you, without spoiling the ending, what is the significance of the fox?
Of the fox, without spoiling the ending. I have to leave the fox. I can't really explain that because I can only say that I wish there were a way to explain it without. There is a fox. The fox makes an appearance. The appearance has something to do with, it's sort of a beautiful thing about the wilderness of Savannah, which is right next to us. That encampment, the Savannah Wildlife Refuge, that area is still untouched after hundreds of years. That idea that we're surrounded by this incredibly beautiful wilderness. And there's also this wildness about Savannah. And it's always a city it's been a city of surprising corruption through the years. I was just talking to a ex-police officer who gave me a ride in the limo today, and he was talking about the corruption. So it's never gone away. But at any rate, there are these intrusions of the wilderness on our civilized world here. And so I suppose that I don't want to be too specific about the fox, but
Okay, they'll have to read it.
actually, I don't know that we even have to admit that there is a fox.
There's not one. Forget about it.
know what that means. I don't know your question.
Are there any other questions? Oh, I see one right over here.
Hi, thank you so much for being with us tonight. In your book, I felt like you sort of glamorized the homeless community, and you mentioned earlier that you were friends with them, and you referenced there are archaeologists living in the homeless community, and I was just wondering if you have any pushback from the homeless community, that maybe your perception of this like sort of glamorized community might have actually reflected in our current homeless community in this area.
Well, I think that's a really good question. Because that would be the farthest thing from my mind to glamorize the homeless community. It's a community of, it's filled with, there's lots and lots of people there who are in great pain. Whether or not homeless communities should even be permitted is that's a really, really difficult question, whether or not you could end them with some enlightened stroke of the pen. I mean, I don't know that will ever happen either. I think I was simply recognizing that they exist, that they're filled with a surprising spectrum of humanity. Years ago, when I had the symposium on Flannery O'Connor here, I brought Roy Blunt, a fabulous humorist who knew Flannery well. I brought several Flannery historians and a woman from the homeless community. So I asked each of them, what made Flannery O'Connor so mean? And I think that's a very valid question. No matter how much you love Flannery O'Connor, she's mean to her characters. She never lets them have a nice day. And so we went to each of the people, and then the woman from the homeless community said, in fact, the Truman Marriott. She said, lupus is what makes her so mean. I know, because I have it. And she gave the most brilliant description of, but a very, very painful description of what it was like for her to try to live in this universe with lupus. And homelessness was, she could have lived in a hospital, but she didn't want to live in a hospital. There were a number of people who were living in that community because that was their choice. My friend James Kitchens, I put his story. If you go to the Kingdoms of Savannah.com, you'll find a story from James Kitchens. Just an incredible storyteller. And he lived in the Truman Marriott because it was his choice. He could have, he had a job, he could have spent money on rent, he didn't choose to. So all I'm trying to say is that there's a mix of people. But there's also a lot of crime, there's a lot of danger, and I hope that I showed that as well. I didn't mean to glamorize it.
Thank you for that answer. Any more questions? Oh, I see, in the balcony.
Yeah, hi. My name is Jasmine Davies. I'm a tax lover. I was going to say, the way that you describe the birth of, anyway, I was going to say, the way that you described the book, it was so really funny and wonderful, and I was wondering, why did you pick the name Kingdom? I just wanted to know, why did you do that? It's kind of cool and mystical. I just wanted to know that.
Thanks. Thank you for that question. Kingdoms, I think you, what would be your answer? Why do I? Because you said it very well.
Not prepared. To me, it felt like you sort of talked about how there are lots of different silos in Savannah. There are communities that might be right next to one another but don't often mix or understand one another. And at least to me, it felt like each of those communities deserved the same respect as Morgana's community. She is the one who's part of High Society Savannah. She lives in, I think it's a Romanesque revival mansion is how you described it. But to me, the word kingdom put importance on these communities. So Stony and her community, she thinks of that as a kingdom. Ransom, who is someone who made the choice to kind of go against high society and to live in those homeless encampments, thinks of his community as a kingdom. So I hope that was a good answer.
I think that's great.
All right, well, I think that's all the questions that we have time for today. I have to say thank you again so
Ariel,
much.
thank you so much. Ariel, can we have a round of applause? A really great interview. Thank you so much. And by the way, thank you, Tara, and thank you to all the folks at the Savannah Book Festival. What you do is just absolutely wonderful and magnificent. Thank you.
So we're so happy to have you here. On behalf of the book festival, I would like to present you with this gift. And can I get just one more round of applause for George?
Thank you.
Well, we hope you will join us again tomorrow night for the keynote address. Thank you, George.
Thank you.
With Douglas Preston and Lincoln Child, the New York Times #1 best-selling authors of the wildly popular Pendergrass series. And be sure to join us on Festival Saturday and Sunday's closing address as well. Thank you for coming.